So if we start with cash savings as the first topic really, and what we find really in terms of the cash savings component, when it comes to international parents, this becomes far more relevant because it's one of those things that when you potentially live outside of the UK and you need to try and secure the money, you've got two options. You've got the ability to pay up front, which in theory enables you to get some form of reduction from a school. And every school is slightly different in terms of how they'll apply their reduction principles. Some of the kind of better known schools, they won't be particularly flexible in terms of what they'll allow people to pay, whereas some of, as you kind of go down the different locations of schools, then you may get more kind of leverage in terms of how much your money might buy or not buy. But in terms of savings, you think about how much school fees cost. It's likely to be the second largest cost to any family as you go forward. So we've got a couple of figures here, and so in real terms, the average boarding school, when you send your child to boarding school, at the moment is costing a family £260,000 for the duration. Now that's average. You then take into effect that some of the schools charge £38,000, £39,000 a year, then that obviously will increase quite substantially. In terms of day schools, then the day school cost on average is £141,000 at the moment. So again, that can go up as well. So again, the higher end day schools charging currently £19,000, £20,000 a year. So just factor that in. So it's a big commitment when you then go forward with it. And so it's how do you achieve this commitment? What do you do? And so we look at the kind of the savings, the investments, the borrowing, the selling, the surplus income and the gifts, and it's how do you merge those together for your specific circumstances. So savings first. Some people naturally, by the circumstance they're in, might have a large amount of cash savings, and they think to themselves, okay, holding that savings at the moment is doing nothing. Inflation is going through the roof, and what do we do with it? We're protected up to £85,000 from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. So how do we balance it? How do we protect ourselves? What do we do? And there are some companies out there that basically enable you to, for want of a better description, it's a bit of a wrap. So you can go into lots and lots of banks through one location. So you don't have to go and fill in lots and lots of different applications. It can protect you from Financial Services Compensation Scheme components of 85, but it also enables you to get the best rate you can. So if you've got surplus money that's come out of a business and you're thinking about investing it somewhere else into a new business that you're doing, or you've had an inheritance come through, it's thinking about how to protect it. And there are ways of just trying to get better rates each day as you go forward. Okay? So that's the kind of the cash component. You then think about investments, and dependent on who you are and what stage you're at, then there's different options in investments. So in terms of investments, I'm going to pass to Paul, who's going to talk through some different investment strategies that you can think about in general terms, and dependent on who you are, it might apply or not apply. So to carry on the investment side of things, the ISAs and unit trusts work very well for new parents. So it's that thought of how do I build money up to pay for fees as I go forward. So based on the average figures that we started with at the beginning of the conversation in terms of the day school and the boarding school costs, on somebody who just does prep, for example, based maybe in Kent or up in Gloucestershire, by starting on the date of birth, you could think, well, £600 a month going forward per child from the day that person's born with a 5% compound growth rate should then enable you to put somebody through a basic prep school. If you're thinking boarding school and just secondary boarding school, then you might be thinking more about £1,200 or £1,300 per month needed from the date of birth to put it away. And then when you go up for the entire education, including university, you've got to think about £1,500 or £1,600 a month if you're intending just to gradually build money up as you go forward. Now, bearing in mind our time this morning, we're quite restricted in terms of what we can cover. But there's also things called investment bonds, which means that dependent on whether you're a grandparent and whether you're a grandparent with capital or whether you've got surplus income, you can decide whether to invest onshore or offshore, which means you can allocate money and enable it to grow tax-free as well, which also means it's outside of estate for inheritance tax issues. There's then also, depending on how much you earn each year, the ability to try and gain extra tax relief, because there are some investments that enable you to get 30% tax relief, providing you hold those investments for either 3 years or 5 years. The money, depending on how it's performed, comes back to you, and you can do the same again. So you can recycle the same money through different investments, getting 30% relief. So in very simple terms, if you've got £10,000, you make an investment, you could get 30% back not immediately once invested, so £3,000 back as a tax relief. If you've got a capital gains deferral, you can then potentially have £2,800 or £2,000 back as well. So for a £10,000 investment, you could get £5,000 back. You could hold that investment for the duration that it needs to be held for, which is 3, 5, or however long it takes to mature, and then sell that investment and do the same again. So you can recycle and get the tax efficiencies of those types of investments. Unfortunately, there's not really the time to go through that now. So that's kind of a quick synopsis on investments, and I appreciate it's been very quick. The next stage is thinking, okay, borrowing, because some people have said selling and borrowing. Now, a large proportion of people pay for their children's education through borrowing, and there's two types. There's obviously the good borrowing and there's the bad borrowing. The bad borrowing is those people that haven't considered where they are and what they're going to have at the point of retirement. Defined benefit pensions are kind of a thing of the past, particularly for those people sitting in this room, and therefore being able to save for your retirement is also a really important thing. And people borrowing and not thinking about themselves in the future, I can guarantee that your child, even if they're very successful, are going to struggle to support you when you're in your 70s and 80s. So you've got to factor in what type of borrowing there is. Now, some people, again, dependent on your circumstance, have grandparents or great-grandparents who are sitting on assets. And therefore, they've got inheritance tax issues, and they're thinking to themselves, they can't release it because granddad lives in the house, but yet it's going to come down to support the grandchildren in the future. Again, one of the considerations is borrowing from the asset of a grandparent. Now, you have to have advice for this, so don't go off and say, Grandad, you're giving me your house. Simply turn around and think, right, you could borrow some money from here to then feed and pay for school fees down here. It has a number of benefits. It keeps the liquidity of the family going through, but also, depending on how long Granny or Grandad live for, it could be outside of inheritance tax as well in the future. So again, the difference between good and bad borrowing. So that's the borrowing side of things. You then think about gifting.
10 minutes left.
And I appreciate that I'm whizzing through this incredibly quickly, but gifting generally comes from grandparents. And so if a grandparent has an inheritance tax issue, there's the 7-year rule on any capital gift. I don't know if people are aware of that. So you give money, that grandparent or whoever it might be needs to live for 7 years before it's outside of their estate. Otherwise, it's then liable for inheritance tax at 40%. So that's one of the considerations. How do I do this? What do I do? How do I wrap everything into kind of one component of it? We then come to the kind of the bursaries and the scholarship side in terms of not the financial advice side, but the side of trying to go to a school and get the reduction on things. Now, for most of the schools here today, their bursars are here, and their bursars will be able to give you a really, really good indication in terms of what's needed in terms of getting additional forms of funding, because each school is very, very different. So that's the kind of the key components of the various funding. We've gone through savings, investments, borrowings, selling, surplus income. So the final part of surplus income to bear in mind is that if you earn over £100,000 a year, you lose your personal tax-free allowance of £11,500, which effectively means that between £100,000 and £123,000, you're paying a much greater increase of tax on that area. Also, if you're earning over £150,000 a year, up to £210,000 a year, your pension allowances come down as well. So again, when you're looking at your circumstances, bear this in mind and think, are there ways that I can increase my income without pushing myself over the 100, and I can use the 100 to push myself into other things that are efficient for you as well? And that becomes more complicated, but there are ways to, so for example, there is an investment that will give you a dividend tax-free. So at the moment we all have an allowance of £5,000, a dividend tax allowance of £5,000. There are ways of getting the extra tax-free, but that means investing in higher risk things, which for many aren't suitable. But it's being aware of options and everything that's out there.